Tonight, we're honored to be joined by Dr. R.J. Jim Hankinson of the University of Texas at Austin, an eminent scholar of ancient Greek philosophy and science, especially, but not limited to, biology and medicine. Jim earned his degrees in philosophy and classics from Oxford and Cambridge. He's British. Where he was trained by some of the most renowned philosophers and classicists of the 20th century. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that he has lived up to any expectations that may have been set by that pedigree. He is the author of many seminal papers in the field, including important studies of early empiricist epistemology in the Hippocratic Corpus and Galen's Philosophy of Mind. He has written very highly regarded volumes on various figures and texts in the history of science and philosophy, but I'll name just a few of my favorites, especially relevant to tonight's subject. Cause and Explanation in Ancient Greek Thought, The Skeptics, Galen on Antecedent Causes, and Cats and Kittens, Why They're So Cute. Actually, I think one of those isn't by him, but I'm not sure which one. In addition to all of this, he has taught and mentored several scholars who have gone on to make their own marks on the field, including arguably the most brilliant scholar of ancient philosophy that St. Norbert College has ever seen. But in all seriousness, given the fact that St. Norbert College has increasingly positioned itself as a training ground for future medical professionals, and in honor of our ties to the Medical College of Wisconsin, as well as to the many doctors, nurses, and health experts in the community, we thought it fitting to offer a lecture on the history of medicine by someone who could speak also to its roots in ancient philosophy and science as part of the Western intellectual tradition that St. Norbert College holds in such high esteem. And so I present to you Dr. Jim Hankinson.
Well, I can't possibly live up to that introduction, so I won't try. Surely you've got better things to do than... Oh, never mind. Okay. First, just a couple of things about what I mean by the title, or the things I might mean. Ancient and modern medicine is fairly straightforward, reasonably. By ancient, I largely mean Greco-Roman medicine, the medicine as practiced in Greco-Roman antiquity, roughly speaking from the 5th century BCE through to about the 2nd or 3rd CE or AD. That's not to say that I'm not interested in early Chinese and early Indian medicine. I'll say a little bit about some aspects of that in a moment. It's just I don't know anything very much about them. By modern, I mean modern in the sense that's, in two senses. In one sense, by modern, I mean modern in the way that we typically talk about modern when we talk about modern philosophy, i.e. starting in around about 1630. I mean, modern's been going a long time if you're a philosopher. But I also mean by modern medicine, the sort of medicine with which we're familiar as practiced in, if you like, the orthodox current Western way of doing things. Now, there's an awful lot of things you might take issue with in that way of characterizing things, but you, roughly speaking, know what I mean, the sort of medicine that we typically experience in our clinics and our hospitals. But I will be talking about other alternative aspects or mentioning them as we go along. And the basic motivating thought behind all of this, if there is such a thing, is to try and give you some kind of general picture of how modern medicine is by comparison with ancient medicine, and also what sorts of continuities one might see exhibited through the very long tradition. Because if there's one thing that immediately strikes one as a kind of historian, or indeed just a general interested party who looks at what has happened in the medical, biomedical, perhaps I should say, professions in the West, primarily in the West, but of course we've exported a lot of that around the world, in the last really 150 years, maybe 200 years, arguably just a bit more than that, is just how enormously different things look now from the way they did certainly 200 years ago. And indeed, how enormously different they look than the way that, from some ways in which they looked only about 100 years ago. And I'll be mentioning a couple of examples of that in passing as we go along. Modern medicine, as we understand it, is in some ways very, very, very modern. But, as I said also earlier on, there are certain continuities as well that we can look at. It's one of those things that's sort of fashionable among certain sorts of people to try and show just how advanced ancient civilizations were and how much they got right and how they anticipated all the things we're doing. There's a little bit of truth in that, in my view, but not as much as some people, and I'm thinking of you, the History Channel, are inclined to suppose. There are enormous discontinuities, very obviously, between the way we live and how we go about structuring our lives, and crucially, the techniques, the technologies we use in our lives from anything of 2,000 years or so ago. Okay, but that's just by way of general preamble. So the subtitle of this is basically continuities and discontinuities. So I'll be picking and choosing. I won't be going through all of these particular cases. So here are ways in which you might think that standard, ordinary, orthodox, contemporary medicine has something in common with, at any rate, large sections of the practice of ancient medicine, Greco-Roman medicine, roughly speaking from the 5th century BC through to the imperial period. First is that it emphasizes the rational as opposed to supernatural. And part of that is that it tends to be causally based in the sense that the medical practice and the underlying physiology that's supposed to underpin it and the pathologies and nosologies that surround that are supposed to derive from an understanding of how the body functions under normal circumstances and the sorts of things that can go wrong with it, and hence what you can do, if you can, to counteract those suboptimal conditions. The third thing is that a great deal of it is empirical, at least in a very general sense. That's to say, the way in which a lot of these practitioners, and I will be saying all sorts of things about how you can't make very broad generalizations about this, but a lot of these practitioners were concerned at least to try and produce accounts that were empirically not reliable, but empirically adequate in a sense. They were supposed to be answerable to the tribunal of experience, as Quine once put it. The crucial test is this supported by actual evidence? And, of course, at the practical end, does it work? Another thing which one might think, unites, at least in very general terms, contemporary and ancient practice, is the use of pharmacological tools. This actually developed through the ancient world, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But they were very highly developed. It's a further question whether they were much good. Some of them were. Pharmacopoeias, accounts of and descriptions of drugs and how to put the drugs together, and also the therapeutic and efficacious powers of various drugs, either singly or in combination. And finally, and I will say a bit more about this, what I'm calling a mixed understanding and treatment of mental illness. By mix, I simply mean the mixture in question is a mixture between considering mental illnesses as simply being a kind of on a continuum with physical illnesses. They are fundamentally physical, it's just that they affect things like cognition and need to be treated in the same sort of way on the basis of the understanding, as we might think of it, the neurophysiology, the neurochemistry of the conditions. But equally, and this was a very strong strand in antiquity and still is now, this goes sort of hand in hand with the idea that, well, in quite a lot of cases, you can achieve considerable degrees of therapeutic efficacy. Of course, how much you can is a matter of widespread dispute, by more directly cognitive approaches. I'm thinking here of cognitive therapies of one sort or another, what have been called in one form or another for a very long time talking cures, going to a therapist, talking it out and so on. And that the coexistence of these two distinct ways of both thinking about the etiology of mental illnesses and how we should go about treating them tend to go together in a rather uncomfortable theoretical combination. And that's something that's been going on for a very long time. It's something you can see in one of the main focuses of my intellectual life, Galen, the great 2nd and 3rd century of our era, AD, doctor and philosopher in imperial Rome. Contrast that with discontinuities. I'll go through these more quickly because I'm going to be dealing with them more generally. The way in which diseases were classified and individuated often looks very, very different. And there are particular reasons for that we'll see in a moment. One of which is the rejection or simply the downplaying of any kind of infectious transmission model of disease vectoring, which, of course, we're all familiar with in a variety of different contexts. But the general idea that you can catch something by being too close to someone who's already got it is an absolutely fundamental feature of the way in which we think of the vectoring of certain sorts of diseases. It's very strikingly absent from the sorts of doctors I'm going to be concentrating on, although not wholly absent from antiquity. And going along with this is a rejection, or perhaps just to some extent not even a consideration, of the invasive organism paradigm of disease. What diseases are, or consist in, are the nocive effects of microorganisms which get into the system one way or another and produce deleterious effects. This is something altogether quite different. This is also a discontinuity. One of the favourite therapeutic interventions, not interestingly in the earliest period, not interestingly really greatly in the Hippocratic period, but much later on, certainly in Galen, is the therapeutic practice of bloodletting, of drawing blood from patients in various conditions, actually quite a wide variety of different conditions, often underpinned by quite distinct and in some ways not obviously compatible, and in some cases obviously not compatible, theoretical considerations. And this, of course, is one of those practices that had a very, very, very long life. It was still going on in the 19th century. It was falling out of fashion in the 19th century, but it was still going on in quite a general sort of way in the 19th century. And it was killing people quite frequently, as late as, say, the 1820s. Most notably, one of my great heroes, the Romantic poet Lord Byron, who died just over 200 years ago at the hands of his doctors when suffering from a fever in Greece. But here's, bloodletting is a discontinuity, but it's a discontinuity with very, very modern medicine, with one or two very minor counterexamples, which I may mention a bit later on. And there's something called multiple consultation, which also was quite common among the well-off in antiquity. Not quite the same as getting a second opinion, which we're all familiar with, but something rather different. And if I have time, because as I say, I will be picking and choosing among the various topics, I'll say a little bit about that, I hope, a bit later on. So here's the third general category. Are these discontinuities or continuities or both or neither? Well, one is a very strong emphasis on regimen, not just what you eat, but lifestyle, the sort of exercise you take and things of that sort. Very, very commonly emphasized from the earliest period, from the earliest period of the development of what I'm calling rational medicine, the Hippocratic period. Again, something which is greatly emphasized by Galen 5 or 6 centuries later. And of course, we still think in these terms. We do think about how to construct and promote a healthy lifestyle, although, of course, there are disagreements as to precisely what that consists in, as there were in the ancient world. A second thing which you might think cuts a bit both ways is the occurrence of competing paradigms, different fundamental theoretical models of the structure of disease, different and incompatible ones. Now, if you concentrate, as I sort of have been doing so far, on on what I've been calling orthodox Western medicine, then the extent to which there are genuinely competing paradigms is pretty limited. I mean, there are disputes about pathology, disputes about what certain pathogens are, but the general thought normally is that those disputes can be and should be, and with a bit of luck will be, resolved by simply further practice in the ordinary procedures of medical research in that general overarching theory. We don't tend to think, at least not from the point of view of orthodox medicine, orthodox Western medicine, of radically different kinds of ways of thinking about things. And there were plenty of those in the ancient world. Of course, we do have, if we go outside the scope of what I've been calling contemporary orthodox Western medicine, we've got certainly alternative types of healing practice, homeopathy being a fairly obvious example. And you can still get homeopathic treatment on the National Health Service in Britain. That's if you can get any treatment at all these days on the National Health Service. But it is formally recognised in a sense, even though in certain pretty obvious ways. At least if you treat it as a theoretical concept, homeopathy is quite at odds with what we tend ordinarily to think about the structure and vectoring and appropriate kinds of intervention we can take on diseases. Again, that's something that can be further discussed, if you like. Now, what about anatomy and physiology? Well, there was a great deal of it done in antiquity. Initially, it was pretty sketchy. Some of the Hippocratic accounts of the structure of the bones are fairly rudimentary, and much more rudimentary are some of the early accounts of the vascular system. But by the time you get to Galen, admittedly that's 5 centuries or so later, Galen has a very detailed understanding of the sorts of channels and pathways that exist inside the human body, even though he was radically mistaken about what some of them did and how they did it. So again, that's one of the ways in which you've got a sort of continuity, certainly a continuity of interest, but a serious discontinuity. And if I have time, I will mention some of the really important moves that were made right at the beginning of the modern period of modern medicine, that utterly restructured the way in which people thought of how the body worked and what the structure of the body itself really was. And finally, there's the issue of technology. Obviously, what we think of as technology is orders of magnitude different from anything that you might think of as technology in antiquity, but there's a certain sort of technology, and it's in some respects relatively advanced. And we'll come back to that at some point. Okay, so that's just the preamble. That's taken me 15 minutes. What I'm going to do now is look a bit more closely at some of those 13 or 14 points that I've just gone through rather rapidly. Now, I mentioned first of all that one of the things that does link a certain set of attitudes in antiquity, not quite beginning with the Hippocratics, who in any case are not a unified school of doctors. The Hippocratic treatises start to be produced in the 5th century BC, and they're a very, very diverse ragbag of different things. They accrete around the name of Hippocrates, the supposed father of medicine, but it's very, very unlikely, vanishingly so in my view, that any of them were written by the historical Hippocrates, even if there was one. I think there almost certainly was a historical Hippocrates. But this is just it's one of those names around which certain sorts of treatises regarding medical practice accrete. And these are very various and mutually inconsistent, and were produced over quite a long period of time. The majority of the ones that most people are familiar with come from the 5th and the 4th centuries BC, but there are some that are quite clearly centuries later than that. How they got put together is the sort of thing that is of antiquarian interest, but I will not be talking about that at all. But a crucial feature of part of this tradition was this emphasis on what I've been calling rational, by which we mean non-supernatural approaches to the understanding and attempts to deal with disease. If you cast your mind back, some of you I hope will remember this, to the very beginning of Greek literature, the beginning of the Iliad. Homer's Iliad starts with a plague that's visited on the Greeks camped outside Troy by Apollo, because he's upset at the treatment meted out by the Greeks to the daughters of one of his priests. And this causes widespread death and destruction, beautifully described and so on. That's an exemplar, if you like, of what one might think of as a supernatural way of thinking about disease. It's a sort of punishment administered by angry gods, in this case. And the approach you might take to that, of course, would be to propitiate the gods, try and win them over by sacrifice or prayer or whatever the particular ritual basis of your practice is in that particular religion. But it doesn't involve thinking in terms of a rational, causally based origin for these kinds of afflictions. And here's a quote, and I'll be doing some lengthy quotes as we go along. This is from a very early text in the Hippocratic Corpus, written probably in the 420s or thereabouts BC, called Sacred Disease. Some of you, I hope, will know what this is. And this is the preamble to it. The following concerns the so-called sacred disease. It seems to me to be no more divine or sacred than any other. Just as the other diseases have their own nature and originating cause from which they derive, so this too has its own nature and originating cause. In other words, it's in general type, it's no different from other kinds of diseases. There's a rational explanation as to what's going on in terms of effects that are happening that undermine the proper, ordinary, normal working of the body. And also, of course, in this case, because the sacred disease is epilepsy or seizure conditions, diseases which have interesting psychological correlates. But people think it to be something divine on account of their lack of experience of it and astonishment at it, for it's like none of the others. In other words, the way in which it presents is striking. It's odd, it's numinous. People do odd things, fall down, froth at the mouth, and so on. It seems kind of strange. But the point is, really, that's a misleading impression. We should treat it in the same general way as we treat everything else. In other words, we shouldn't just say, okay, this is a divine disease, better sacrifice to whichever god you think you've annoyed. No, it's a physiological condition with physiological causes, and with a bit of luck, things that we can intervene on to palliate, or with even more luck, get rid of it. But, on the other hand, when you actually look at the etiology that's offered, it's really very, very weird. the author says that this disease is caused by an excessive build-up of phlegm in the cerebral cavity. Phlegm being one of the things that later become canonized as the four humours, the four fundamental or important fluid constituents of the body. That's also a very long and complicated history. And indeed, when I was last here in this room 10 years ago, that's what I was talking about. But I won't be talking about it tonight. So this is the so-called rational explanation, causal explanation. You've got a build-up of this stuff. You've got too much of it. It gets into the head and interferes, among other things, with cognitive and motor functions. And one of the things that the author appeals to is, at least he claims, that this disease is particularly common in goats. I sometimes wonder whether he was aware of the so-called fainting goats phenomenon. These don't actually faint. They don't actually faint. It's a temporary loss of muscle tone. But you may have seen these rather amusing videos of goats just keeling over and falling down when they receive a certain kind of stimulus. I've no idea whether that's the case or not. But he says, look, if you open the head of a dead goat, you'll see the head is full of lots of this cold, sticky liquid, which is what they call phlegm, and that must be what's responsible. In other words, there are very obvious shortcomings both in the supposed causal explanation and also in the sort of empirical evidence that's being produced in favour of it. Because remember, empirical adequacy was one of the other things that sort of mattered. And another thing, counterexample, is another text of roughly the same period in the Hippocratic Corpus, quite clearly written from a very different and distinct theoretical standpoint, called Regimen. And it's not just about lifestyle, but quite a lot of it is. And that contains quite a lot of injunctions to engage in certain sorts of propitiation of divinity. It's a good thing to try and get the gods on your side. Although there also are, in this treatise, attempts to give a very general account of the physiological basis for physical and indeed mental health. I'm not going to talk about that very much. This is just another way of talking about or filling out what I mean by a causally based approach. And the vast majority of this is allopathic. Opposites cure opposites is a Hippocratic slogan. You've got to produce something that counteracts the noxious tendency. So the thought basically is that not all diseases, but a large number of diseases consist in something getting out of balance. They're becoming an excess or also a deficiency in some cases of the appropriate amount of some suitable constituent, whatever that is. There's a lot of differentiation and dispute about that. But this is where the origin of humoral theory comes from. So if you've got too much of something, and that's producing harmful effects, then you get rid of some of it, or you counteract it by applying something with an opposing causal force. I mean, it sort of makes sense in a very general sense, but once again, the underlying physiology was radically inadequate. And I mentioned that these people generally, although again differing enormously from individual to individual, wanted their accounts, at least in some sense, to be empirically based or in accordance with empirical evidence. Think of cutting open goats' heads and so on. And there's various cases that I'm not going to talk about in that case. But here's quite an important, and this is a sort of counterexample in some ways. In the histories of the great Athenian historian Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, the huge conflict that ravaged the Greek world, primarily between the Greek superpowers of Athens and Sparta. Relatively early on in that conflict, a quite suddenly appearing, although its progress could be traced. It started in certain other parts of the Greek world and then spread through them. according to Thucydides, this massively serious epidemic disease, the plague, about whose precise nature there's still a great deal of dispute. And I think probably unresolvable dispute, but that doesn't much matter. Thucydides gives this very, very famous and important account of the impact of the plague on Athens. It was enormous, it caused very widespread fatality, and so on. And Thucydides talks explicitly about the fact that it was infectiously transmitted. And also that most of the attempts, all of the attempts to deal with it weren't any good. Neither the doctors, the so-called rational doctors, nor the divine doctors, the divine healers, the supernatural healers, and I'll come back to them in a moment, they didn't make any difference at all. Indeed, Thucydides notes that the doctors suffered particularly because they visited the sick and they got sick as a result of it. So there, it seems quite clear that Thucydides is talking about and is aware of infectious transmissibility. Something which figures almost nowhere in the orthodox accounts that you find in the Hippocratic corpus, in later rationalist schools, and indeed in Galen, who thought of himself as Hippocratic 5 centuries later. I'm not going to talk here about the pharmacology, and I may come back and talk about mental illness, because I don't want to spend too much time talking about it now. I will just say one thing, though. This is mostly from Galen. We do get these descriptions of delirium, delirious conditions in the epidemics, a set of Hippocratic texts, again, not written by the same authors, but one of the features of these texts are detailed, more or less detailed, case histories of particular the onset and the development and the eventual outcome of a disease of some particular individual. They're always related to, well, these case histories are all case histories of particular individuals. There are also general accounts of endemic and epidemic conditions in certain areas, but the case histories have this general form. And they tend to start off with saying, so-and-so got sick following something or other. So there's an attempt to find something that might function as the triggering cause. Remember, the author of The Sacred Disease said, this disease has triggering causes like any other. There are things that set it going. And you find an attempt in the epidemics case histories to find something like that. But anyway, and these include psychological conditions, delirium, and various other sorts of, mania, among other things. Melancholia has a very long history. There's a long description of it in the text called Problems, attributed to Aristotle. It's certainly not by Aristotle, but it's from that general period. But Galen, my man Galen, wrote a text called The Powers of the Soul Follow the Mixtures of the Body. Almost fairly reductive sort of account of the dependency of psychological conditions on physiological conditions. It's not quite fully reductive, but it gets very close to it. And the odd thing about this is that elsewhere Galen talks in completely different terms, because he endorses the talking cures. He says you can make people less prone to, anger, something that greatly exercised the ancients, to be proneness to being prone to outbursts of anger by talking to them, drawing attention to the harmful consequences of them giving into their tendency to fly into rages. And there's no attempt to try, of course it's very hard to see how you might do this, but there's no attempt to try and do that in terms of how talking to somebody could alter their fundamental material constitution. There are one or two points in Galen where he sort of hints that that might be the case, but he never tries to develop it, for the very good reason that he couldn't. But arguably, because this is one of the continuities, that's still something we're familiar with in one form or another today. I mean, particularly, with certain kinds of condition, depression being an obvious case. If you're suffering from depression, you're likely to go to a doctor, ordinary doctor, who will prescribe you various pharmacological remedies. But you might also think, and plenty of people do think this, and plenty of people are encouraged to think this, that it might also be a good idea to go and talk to somebody about it. How do we put those things together in a coherent theoretical structure? Well, crucially, typically we don't. We don't try. And in a way, this is a testament to a certain kind of empiricism. Look, if it works, of course, it's a further question whether it does, but if it works, then who cares why it does? And that view, that kind of, if you like, sort of all-embracing sort of view, is one that we find also in the ancient world. So anyway, that's the bit about the talking cure. This is another text of Galen's. Oh, carthology. I introduced that there because, of course, that's still a medical term, carthology or carthologia, that's how you pronounce it. That's actually a Greek word. Galen uses that very same word. Carthology is just a transliteration of carthologia, and it's a kind of it's a symptom of a certain kind of fever, delirium, usually consequent upon high fevers, where the sufferer obsessionally tries to remove bits of fluff or lint or something from their body or from their bedclothes, or little twigs. That's what carthos means in this case, which aren't there, and it's still a recognised symptom. Galen himself talks about suffering from it himself in a certain feverish condition and realising that they weren't really there, but being unable to help himself from doing it. Anyway, I'm not going to talk really very much about this at all. I'm going to move on from this. We do find, and this goes all the way back to the Hippocratics, it's all over the epidemics, the talk of different kinds of fever classified in terms of their periodicities. Tertian fever is essentially a fever that peaks every 48 hours and then goes into remission. Quartan fever is a fever that peaks every 72 hours and then goes into remission. It's pretty clear that a lot of what's being described are various sorts of recurrent malaria, which was absolutely endemic in the ancient world. So we've got descriptions of things that we can sort of recognise, but they're described in terms which are, in a certain sense, quite unrecognisable. And here's another important difference. We tend to think of the fever as being a consequence of the illness. It's something the body is doing, in fact, in order to try and fight the illness. It's not the illness itself. Whereas for most of the ancients, the fever itself is the illness. And that sort of thought lingers on in the way in which we think of and talk of and still sort of describe certain kinds of diseases. In other words, that sort of thought was still, it wasn't a metaphor, it certainly wasn't a dead metaphor, it was a prevalent way of thinking about things maybe 150 years ago. Anyway, so we've got, and the other thing is that diseases are conceived of in individual cases. All diseases are, in a sense, bespoke. Every individual has their own disease because they have their own particular constitutional structure. And so what can go wrong for them, an imbalance for them, is not going to be the same as an imbalance for anybody else. Whereas we tend to think in terms of diseases as being strongly unified. There is such a thing as diphtheria, as it might be, or bubonic plague, tetanus. And of course, people may be differentially affected by it according to what sorts of immunities they've built up and their natural strengths and so on. But the disease itself is a single unified thing. That's less, at the very least, that's something that's undermined or underestimated in the overall Greek way of thinking about things. But as I say, we do get descriptions of what's quite clearly tetanus and of bubonic plague, not the plague in Athens, but we get other descriptions of it, tuberculosis and so on. So we can recognise what we would recognise as disease entities in their ancient descriptions, even and being classified as, in some sense, unified conditions, even though the other features of them, the etiology, the general causal basis for the understanding of whatever interventions you produce, are quite different. Rabies is another very important case of that. Finally, let's look at this concentration on what I'm calling specific environmental predisposing capacities to disease. Part of the text of the epidemics, the bits that aren't individual case histories, are concerned with the sorts of diseases that were prevalent in a particular place at a particular time. In Thasos in early spring, you got a lot of this kind of thing. And then there'll be a description of the prevailing weather conditions. Were they different from the way they normally were, and so on? All in an attempt to try and produce correlations between differences in the prevailing environmental conditions and different tendencies towards relatively widespread diseases. And this other text, Airs, Waters, Places, that I'm talking about here is another Hippocratic text, which talks about types of atmosphere, types of water supply and water system, and places here means, roughly speaking, citing the way in which a particular city, or indeed a particular individual house or farm, is positioned. Is it north-facing or south-facing? Does it have clear, clean running water, or is the water brackish, and so on? And these are is the air damp and heavy, or is it largely light and warm? And these are the things that are taken to be the important variables in disease prevalence. Notice the types of the material themselves. It's the sort of air you've got. Is it thick, compressed, or rarefied? The sort of water you've got. Is it light? They actually use the language of lightness. Or is it heavy and thick and brackish? But they don't think of these things as we might think of, because we might think, well, yes, it's a good idea not to drink water that's been standing around for quite a long time. But we think of that in terms of, well, that's likely to be contain noxious things, waterborne diseases and so on, in terms of individual organisms in it which are likely to cause trouble. That's not the way in which these things are standardly thought of in the ancient world. And this goes along with what I'm calling a general rejection of the infectious transmission model. Now, we've already seen in Thucydides seems to be quite well aware, is quite well aware, that there are certain kinds of disease, like the plague at Athens, where if you get close to a sufferer, you greatly increase the likelihood that you yourself are going to suffer. It looks as though the disease is spread from one individual to another. How? Well, no, that might be something that we can disagree about. Some people will see, actually we won't because I don't have time to do this, I'm going to be stopping fairly shortly. Galen talks about this in terms of breathing in air which has been altered by the structure of somebody else's body. Not that you're breathing in pathogens in the air, but you're just breathing in altered air, which causes the problem. So there are ways in which you can try and give a model for why being close to somebody suffering from something might be implicated in your coming to suffer the same thing. But it's crucially not about transmission by way of vectoring microorganisms or something like that. And in general, more generally, the thought is, well, this idea of infectious transmission is very greatly played down. Now, why is that? Well, I'm just going to say a bit about this, and then I'll have to more or less wrap up. There's this term miasma. Of course, it's this term we still use in perhaps a slightly archaic English. It came in later medical texts to mean something like the bad air that you get around swamps and so on. Sort of fetid, smelly sort of air has a miasma about it. And it was thought that that in and of itself is what's causing the disease. But in its earliest usages, miasma is a sort of ritual uncleanliness. It's the sort of thing that, well, for instance, that Oedipus suffered from. He had a miasma. Why? Well, because he'd done these terrible things. This was a sort of something that hung around him like a kind of noxious cloak, which was capable of affecting other people badly. You don't want to get too close to these people because they're unclean. But what does that mean? Well, roughly speaking, what it means is they've been condemned by the gods. So the idea of miasma, which is a transmissible sort of thing, that's why you banish Oedipus to the groves at Colonus. He can't come into Athens because you don't want somebody like that close to you. Why not? Because their pollution will cause your pollution. That's transmissible. But what is it that's being transmitted there? Well, something like divine displeasure. So this idea of miasma, which is something that's transmissible and it's something that a person can be infected with, has this fundamentally divine or supernatural connotation. And it's partly because of that, in my view, largely because of that, that it gets superseded. When the rational model is being developed, what they want to do is to say, as the writer of The Sacred Disease said, look, there's nothing specifically different about this, but there's nothing generically different about this disease. It's a disease just like any other. It has these weird, numinous-looking symptoms, but that's all they are. It's got a nature and derives from an originating cause, just like the others. A physical originating cause, not divine displeasure. So the idea of transmissibility, I'm suggesting, became associated with what was becoming thought of in certain circles, by no means everywhere, because, of course, there are different and competing ways of thinking about these things. But in the emerging rational models of medicine, this was associated with what people were thinking of as an outdated, superstitious model of medicine, which should be replaced by the primacy of environmental factors and factors having to do with lifestyle. So malaria, for instance, I've already mentioned malaria. Of course, our term literally means something like bad air. The thought is that you sicken when you suffer malaria because you've inhaled and taken into yourself these unhealthy kinds of air that congregate around fetid, marshy places, swamps. That's the explanation of the disease. It's the air itself. It's not because nasty things breed in the swamps and infect you. Here's some long text, which I'm not going to talk about, where there is talk, and this is in Galen, about something he calls seeds of plague, which it looks as though he's trying to find a way of accounting for what look as though they are pretty obvious facts of communicability of the sort in plague conditions, in serious epidemic conditions, of the sort that Thucydides had noticed. But I won't have time to talk about that. Now, this is to do with what I'm calling the general rejection of the invasive paradigm of disease, which, of course, is, again, something that's strikingly modern. If you think about the 19th century debates about cholera, what caused cholera, this is happening in the middle of the 19th century, there was the prevalent orthodoxy really was something very much like the kind of Hippocratic Galenic model. That yes, it was caused by water, but it's something, as it were, that's wrong with the water, not that the water itself contains other pathogens that are then going to do different individual work. And there are isolated counterexamples. Quite a famous one, well, famous if you're in the business, is these things in a text by a Roman writer called Varro, quite an interesting man. He wrote on agriculture, but also on other things. He talks about little animals, and he gives advice. It's in the form of a dialogue. Don't build your farm on swampy ground, not just because of miasma, here not meaning the aura of divine displeasure, but meaning something like the unhealthy exhalations of bad air, but also because tiny animals, invisible to the eye, breathe there, are carried on the air, get into the body through the mouth, and cause diseases which are hard to get rid of. That does look very like a kind of early anticipation of the infectious microorganism model of disease transmission. It's a further question why he thought that was the case. These things were invisible, and of course, they didn't have microscopes. That's one of the aspects of technology developing in the 17th century that is of enormous importance. Crucial, of course, in the revolution that Pasteur is part of in the 19th century, which is relevant to the move away from the kind of models of cholera that I was talking about a moment ago. Here's something, though, that Varro's main character says, well, what should I do? Well, sell your farm for as much as possible and get the hell out of there. That's the cure, as it were. Well, anyway. And we've got something else in another on agriculture, written a bit later. Marshes breed animals armed with noxious little spikes. Now, this is mosquitoes, but there's no hint there that these are disease-bearing, as opposed to just being rather unpleasant and uncomfortable. So that's not a counterexample. Anyway, I'm going to finish, I think, because I'm not going to get on mostly by talking about bloodletting. I mentioned that. Hugely widely practiced, although not in the initial, not very much. I mean, it's mentioned, but only very tangentially in the early Hippocratic texts. And it's widely practiced in quite different theoretical models. There are people who don't do it, but they're quite rare. Galen is a huge advocate of it. And it's partly, quite largely, as a result of the enormous influence Galen had over subsequent medicine for well over 1,000 years, initially transmitted through the Arabic tradition and then reabsorbed into the Latin West, really from the, I suppose, starting really in the 12th century onwards. That was the model of medicine and physiology that was absolutely dominant. There's a strong case that can be made, I've tried to make it myself, that Galen is the most successful scientist in history, just in terms of the longevity of his influence. Whether or not it was a good influence, of course, is another matter. And I mentioned before Byron's death in 1824, great hero of mine, and killed by his doctors. Now, there are cases, I hinted at this earlier on, diseases which we recognise, hemochromatosis, polycythemia, for instance, where removal of blood is recognised as important therapeutically. But they're very, very rare. And they have to do with overproduction of certain kinds of blood cell. So the natural thing to do is try and get rid of some of these things. It's not because the thought is that by doing that you will reduce a fever or take away the causal underpinnings of fevers, which is the theoretical model of bloodletting, and continue to be for a very, very, very long time. Bloodletting was still being quite widely practiced, often in rural practices and so on, but as late as the latter part of the 19th century. So now we get on to some pretty pictures, and we're going to finish with a few pretty and some not so pretty pictures, having to do with these sorts of things and also having to do with technology, which I mentioned earlier. So that's ancient and medieval bloodletting. That's 18th century England. That's 18th century France. There was a lot of it going on. I won't talk about multiple consultation or regimen. A little bit about competing paradigms. The ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, was very fertile in the production of quite different models of the structure of the body, and indeed attitudes towards whether or not it was important to know anything about that, and consequently quite different models of what dysfunction and hence disease consisted in. And they were quite radically different, although most of them were fundamentally allopathic. And here I'm not talking at all, although I've sort of hinted at the existence of this, of the continuity of religious medicine, religious healing practices, which went on right the way through antiquity. And sort of in kind of competition, but more or less harmonious competition with these other kinds of emergent rationalist practices. Galen was born in the town of Pergamon, modern Bergama, in western Anatolian Turkey. Very big city, very big Greek city. And if you go there, it's a wonderful place. There's a very big complex, the so-called Asclepion, which was a complex of temples dedicated to ritualized medical healing. You go along there and you'd go to sleep in the sanctuary, and according to your dreams, what dreams you had, they'd be interpreted by the healers, and then prescriptions will be produced on the basis of that, and various other things of that sort. Going on in a sense, side by side with quite different sorts of medical practice. And again, this is something that we can sort of see as soon as we start to look away a bit from what I've been calling orthodox medicine, orthodox Western medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, homeopathy, Ayurvedic medicine. And there are a lot of people who will just pick and choose between these sorts of things. And in a sense, you might think, well, why not? And here's another case, another modern case. Very, very many people believe that, yes, diseases like cancer are physiological, they're physiologically based. We should try and treat them to the best of our ability with our physical interventions and our pharmacological interventions. But if that doesn't work, why not have a bit of a pray about it? That might work as well. So we're sort of happy. A lot of us are happy with taking on board these, in a certain sense, perhaps not straightforwardly incompatible, but ways of thinking about things, but ones that are obviously in tension. That was a bit about shortcomings in ancient anatomy and physiology. My favourite example is the rectum. Rectum, of course, means straight. The human rectum isn't straight. It's bent. How did it come to be called the rectum? Well, basically because the people who first were talking about it, this is around about the time, and a bit earlier than Galen, were doing their investigations on non-human animals. They were getting a great deal of their physiology and their anatomy from investigations of non-humans, because it's quite hard to investigate humans. And here are a couple of my heroes from the early modern period who began to change radically the picture that was inherited from Galen. Vesalius, whose radical improvement on human anatomy, De Fabrica, came out in the 16th century, and of course Harvey and the circulation of the blood a few decades later. There's no real hint at all. Some people disagree with this, but I think there's no hint at all in antiquity of anything like a circulatory theory of the blood. People thought, they thought of it in slightly different ways, that blood was produced in the central organs and ramified out through the vascular system to the extremities and was there absorbed and turned into maintaining nutrition. Well, what about technology? Almost done. They had various kinds of things. They had surgical instruments. I'll show you some fairly ghastly-looking ones in a moment. Various orthopedic devices. They were quite good at setting fractures. And the thing called the cupping glass, which is a way of drawing blood. You heat up you make little incisions in the skin, scarify the skin, heat up a glass, put the hot glass over the skin, and the cooling air inside it contracts and draws the blood out. It was supposed to be an efficient and targeted way of letting blood. But they didn't have the microscope. The invention of the microscope being, of course, a really important development over a period of about 50 years in the middle of the 17th century. Even the stethoscope is a relatively modern invention. Indeed, the sort of stethoscope we now use is quite different from the one that Laennec produced in 1816. Now, people were listened to people's chests. They realised that that was therapy, that was diagnostically important, but they didn't have a particular instrument for doing it. And Laennec, in fact, invented it because it was easier and less invasive, an easier and less invasive way of diagnosing illnesses in women. You didn't have to compromise their modesty. That was the reason for doing it. And finally, perhaps the most important of all, general anaesthetics. There's all sorts of reasons why I would quite have liked to have lived in many ways in various periods in the past, but I wouldn't have liked to have lived without general anaesthetics. They're a very modern technical invention. Of course, there are analgesics. Poppy juice was known in antiquity. There were ways of reducing pain and some quite effective ways of doing it. But general anaesthetic, again, is a very modern technique. And then think about vaccination. That's, in a sense, one of the earliest things. Jenner in 1797. Antisepsis, the realisation of the importance of sterile environments, which really only becomes widely accepted, and it doesn't initially become widely accepted. Ignaz Semmelweis, the man who radically reduced the incidence of puerperal fever, postpartum fever in women, by simply insisting on clean environments, was widely ridiculed for this by other doctors in Vienna at the time, and it sent the poor man mad. And also part of that general tradition are Pasteur and Lister. Okay, finally, here's a few instruments, and then I'll shut up. That's another reason why I'm pretty glad I wasn't treated by a doctor in antiquity. They had lots of quite good things for poking and prodding at you, but my God, would you want to be treated with one of those things? Particularly without the benefit of anaesthetics. Maybe we've just all become soft, but I'm very happy about it. And finally, this is something that I once gave a version of this talk, well, some of this talk, years ago to a group of pre-med undergraduates in England, and there was a young woman in the front row who visibly blanched and almost fainted when I produced the next one. So look away if you're worried about this. This is an ancient gynecological instrument. And I'm also quite glad I'm not a woman for that reason. I'm very glad I'm not a woman in Greco-Roman antiquity. And so that was a kind of bit of a rapid whistle-stop tour. I didn't talk about some of the things I wanted to because I didn't want to go on for more than an hour, and I've just about managed not to do that. And so with that, thank you for putting up with this, those of you who've managed to stay.